All right. So again, we're looking at the cell membrane today. We're going to look at some important features about the cell membrane. Most importantly, I'll introduce this by saying that cells must maintain an appropriate internal environment in order to carry out the chemical processes that are required for life. So we're clear about that. We talked about, the concept of homeostasis. All right. So cells must maintain a constant appropriate internal environment, okay, in order to carry out the things that it needs to do. One of the ways that it maintains that equilibrium, okay, is by regulating what's coming in and what's going out. All right. The main way that we do that is by way of that plasma membrane. Okay. Every cell, go ahead and write this point down. This is our first point. Every cell is surrounded by a plasma membrane. Every cell type has a plasma membrane. Okay, now we'll see in our next unit how we'll be able to distinguish between features that are found in some cells and some structures and features that are not found in other cells. But every single cell has a plasma membrane. That's that first outer layer of protection. Okay, one of the most important things that this plasma membrane does is that it separates the internal cell from the external environment. Okay, again, I like to think about it in the context of our skin. Okay, so in addition to, again, separating the cell from the external environment, this plasma membrane also functions to regulate the passage of material into and out of the cell. Okay, so those are two very important functions of the plasma membrane. Right? What questions do we have about that? All right. So these, let's look at the structure here. The biological membranes are a very complex structure, okay? They're made up mostly of two molecules, lipids and proteins. Go ahead and write that down, that the plasma membrane is mostly made up of lipids and proteins. It's a special type of lipid that we'll look at in just a moment, the phospholipid. You may have heard about phospholipids before. But this structure, this complex structure, as I already alluded to, it performs many vital functions, okay? Some of the functions, again, it helps to regulate the passage of materials into and out of the cell, okay? Because we want to think about the connection between the structure and function of this cell, of the cell membrane. So it regulates the passage of materials into and out of the cell. It serves as a surface for chemical reactions to take place. So there are a number of chemical reactions that can take place on the surface of the cell, okay, or on that plasma membrane. The plasma membrane can serve as a means for cells to adhere to other cells, right? So we talked about, I think in chapter 1, the biological organization, where we looked at how cells are organized or interact together to form tissues, tissues form organs, organs form, organs work together to form an organ system. So this cell-to-cell adherence is important in order for tissues to form, okay? So the cell membrane serves as a mechanism, okay? The structures in the cell membrane facilitates this cell-cell adhesion, okay? Contact between cells in order to form tissue. And then lastly, the cell membrane is a means for signal transduction between the external environment and the internal environment inside of the cell. All right, so you can imagine that there needs to be communication. There is communication. There's a lot of signal transduction that takes place, and structures in that cell membrane, particularly those embedded proteins, those membrane embedded proteins, help to facilitate signal transduction and communication between the external environment and inside of the cell. All right, those proteins can, function as receptors, and when the respective ligand for those receptors bind, then there's signal transduction that takes place, and signals are sent inside of the cell. Okay, so this plasma membrane has a very important role in the cell sustaining itself. Okay. So I said the two major components of the plasma membrane are lipids and proteins, okay? There's a special type of lipid that makes up this structure, okay? It's the phospholipid, all right? So we collectively refer to the structure of the membrane as a phospholipid bilayer. Write that down. The structure of a cell membrane is said to be a phospholipid bilayer, okay? And so if you had no clue what that really meant, we can break this word down a little bit. We know that there's some lipids, okay? Phospholipid is just a special type of lipid. And then bilayer, that word bilayer indicates that there's gonna be two layers, all right? The prefix bi means two. And so the cell membrane consists of a fluid bilayer of phospholipid molecules. So we are talking about two layers of phospholipids that are interacting together to form sort of this sheet-like barrier. All right. I know we're used to seeing the representation of the cell kind of in a 1D circle, and you just make that little, spherical shape, and we call it a cell. And that membrane just looks like it's a one-dimensional structure. But if we looked at it, from like this 3D illustration right here, we can see that it's actually a bilayer of phospholipids. It's two layers of lipids interacting together to form that layer, that barrier. So we're describing this structure as a phospholipid bilayer, which is two layers of phospholipids that form a continuous barrier around the cell. Okay, it's enclosing and separating the cell itself, the internal compartment of the cell, from the external environment. What questions do we have about that? Any questions about the structure of the cell? So let's assess the cell membrane. Yeah. Did I hear a question? All right, let's look at the phospholipid molecule. This is a very special type of molecule, and it has properties that we refer to as being amphipathic. Okay, phospholipids are said to be amphipathic. These amphipathic molecules basically contain both a hydrophobic and a hydrophilic compartment or portion. Okay, hydrophobic and hydrophilic, it means that on one end, the head of the phospholipid readily interacts with water. Okay, so this is going to be facing that external environment, because outside of the cell is going to be an aqueous environment. So we have these hydrophilic heads on the phospholipid. So this is one phospholipid molecule right here, if you see my mouse. Okay, this is one phospholipid molecule. Okay, this amphipathic molecule has a hydrophilic head, and then it has these hydrophobic tails. Okay, so this head region, these heads of the phospholipid are hydrophilic, and those would be the regions that readily interact with water. And these hydrophobic tails are going to interact together in the middle, and they are responsible for that semi-permeable feature of the plasma membrane. Okay, these hydrophobic tails is basically congregating in the middle, and it's going to help to regulate what's being able to pass through the membrane. Okay, so these hydrophobic tails are tucked away in the middle, away from water. So if we turn our attention over here to this image, this is a three-dimensional representation of the phospholipid bilayer. Okay, if we look closely, we see that we have one layer of phospholipids here, all right, where we have our heads facing the external component or external environment. Okay, this aqueous environment, we know the cell is surrounded by water. And then if you look here, we also have the head regions creating this internal compartment, which is also an aqueous environment. All right, and then here in the middle, we have these hydrophobic tails creating that thick phospholipid fluid bilayer. Okay, so you should be able to understand and describe the structure of this phospholipid bilayer. Okay. Okay, so I talked about the Phospholipid being a amphipathic molecule where we have the hydrophilic heads. Okay, it is the head regions of the phospholipids that come in contact with water, while the hydrophobic tails are tucked or are congregating together in the middle of the structure, is buried on the interior structure away from water. And so that's the lipid part of the cell membrane. Okay. Now I said there are also proteins found in the plasma membrane, right? And we'll call these membrane proteins. Write that down. Membrane proteins. So we have phospholipids, and then we have our membrane proteins making up the plasma membrane. All right. So the cell membrane is a phospholipid bilayer with proteins embedded. Okay. These proteins are very important for the different cellular activities that take place. All right. Again, I mentioned some of these earlier. Transporting materials. All right. Things and substances need to get into and out of the cell. The proteins that are embedded in the cell membrane are going to facilitate the transport of these materials and molecules into and out of the cell. Transmitting information. Okay, we talked about this concept of signal transduction and communication between the inside of the cell and the outside of the cell. All right, proteins are going to facilitate that. Proteins embedded in that membrane. And then connections between cells, adherence, the formation of tissues. So cell-cell adherence is going to be facilitated by proteins that are embedded in the cell membrane. All right, so these are some very important roles of proteins that are found in the cell membrane. Go ahead and jot those down. If I were to ask you about the role, like why are these membrane proteins so important? They're important because they have some very important roles in the various activities of the cell. All right. Any questions? Awesome. So let's look at some types of membrane proteins. There's two major classes. Write these two down. There are two major classes of membrane proteins that are defined by how they associate with the membrane. Where are they found in the membrane? All right, we have the integral membrane proteins, okay? And then we have these peripheral membrane proteins. Write those two classes of membrane proteins down, okay? So we have two major classes of membrane proteins based on how they are associated with the membrane, okay? One, these integral proteins are going to be those that are tightly associated or firmly bound to the membrane, okay? And they're typically going to span or extend throughout the width or the width of the protein, okay? These integral proteins are so significant such that if you try to remove or release these proteins from the membrane structure, you risk compromising the integrity of that membrane, okay? You will disrupt that bilayer, okay? So when you hear integral, think something that's super important and you don't want to alter it, okay? If we, you're conceptualizing that these integral proteins are a vital part of the structure of this membrane, essentially. And if you try and remove it, you're going to compromise the integrity of the membrane. Peripheral proteins, though, in contrast, are not embedded in that lipid bilayer, okay, but they're going to be located on the inner or outer surface of the membrane. So this image right here is an excellent representation of what this phospholipid bilayer looks like with different proteins embedded throughout. So if you see my mouse moving right here, this blue protein right here represents an integral protein. Okay, this integral protein, as you can see, it extends all the way through the width of this membrane. Okay, so it goes from the internal side all the way out to this external component. This is an integral protein right here. Okay, so if I were to show you an image, I would expect that you can identify a integral protein and label it and as well as a peripheral. So down here, we'll say this is a peripheral protein. Okay, so it is not embedded throughout the membrane, but it is associated with the inner or outer surface of the membrane. Okay, in this case, it's on the inner membrane portion. Okay, so this image, I'll post these slides. This is an image that you can come back to further, examine what this phospholipid bilayer looks like, where we have our 2 layers of lipids here. That's what this red represents. Okay, we have our hydrophilic heads on the external component, because this is going to interact with the aqueous extracellular environment outside of the cell. And then we have our red hydrophilic heads also on this side, which is the internal compartment, intracellular environment, which is also aqueous, or water, contains water. And then we see our hydrophobic tails here in the middle. Okay, so a lot of information here quickly. We talked about why the membrane is so important. It has a lot of vital roles in terms of getting substances into and out of the cell, signal transduction, cell-cell adhesion. And then we talked about the makeup of it. What is it composed of? The composition of this membrane. It's mostly made up of lipids and proteins. Okay, specific type of lipid that's found in the cell membrane, the phospholipid. Okay, we talked about the properties of the phospholipid as having those hydrophilic heads and hydrophobic tails, and how they arrange themselves into that lipid bilayer. And then we just looked at the classes of proteins that are found embedded in the cell membrane. All right, we have our integral proteins that are firmly rooted or attached to the membrane, and then we have those peripheral proteins that are going to be, bound to this, located on this outer or inner surface, okay, of the membrane. Any questions about that? Okay, let's keep going. So let's look at some of the functions of these membrane proteins. So we talked about a few already. Some others are the anchoring. Okay, these membrane proteins can function to anchor cells to other substrates. That's one way we get the interaction with the extracellular matrix. Okay, we talked about transport already. These membrane proteins can function to transport molecules across the membrane. Okay, they can do this by various ways. They can form channels or openings that selectively allow things to passage. Enzymatic functions. Okay, we talked about enzymes just a little bit. Okay, this is a type of protein. Enzymes are important for the chemical reactions that take place inside of the cell. Okay, enzymes are going to function as a biological catalyst that will speed up the rate of a chemical reaction. Okay, and so we have proteins that are in the membrane that can also have enzymatic activity to catalyze the reactions that's taking place near the cell surface. And so this image right here, again, just shows you some representative functions of different proteins. So they can function as transporters. Okay, where this protein creates a channel. You know what a channel is, not like a channel on your TV, but a channel where things can pass through. These transporters can function as channels to facilitate the movement of substances into the cell. They can function as receptors. All right, we talked about this a little bit a moment ago about the signal transduction. So signals need to be sent in order for things to take place. And so proteins can function as receptors to receive specific ligands. Okay, and when these ligands bind to receptors, it can result in a resulting chemical reaction or signals being sent. Enzymes. Proteins in the membrane can function as enzymes. All right, we said that enzymes are responsible for catalyzing chemical reactions. All right, we looked at chemical reactions again back in chapter 2, and we know that chemical reactions are basically when we have, various elements and so forth interacting together. We'll call them reactants, and they interact together and form new substances that we'll call products. Okay, so chemical reactions take place new products are formed. Enzymes can play a role in that by speeding up those reactions. And then anchoring. Okay, those proteins in the cell membrane can help to attach and anchor the cell to the ECM, the extracellular matrix. Okay. And so all this to say that there are a number of vital roles and functions for the proteins that are embedded in the membrane. So you should definitely come back and take a look at some of those functions. The 6 major functions of membrane proteins. All right, we just talked about them. Transport, enzymatic activity. So they function as enzymes, signal transduction, cell-to-cell recognition, intercellular joining, and then attachment to the extracellular matrix. All right, so do take some time as you're going through your text, and when you get to your mastering biology, that you further look at some of these roles of membrane proteins. The next concept we need to look at. Wait, what questions do we have about that before we keep going? Okay. So the next thing we need to look at is the cell permeability. Okay. This term permeability refers to, if something can pass or not. And so cell membrane permeability, the cell must regulate the chemical traffic across that plasma membrane, right? Remember, we said the first job of that plasma membrane is to serve as a barrier between the external environment and the internal environment. And so we use the term permeable to refer to this property, okay? If something is permeable, okay, if it is permeable, if it allows substances to pass through, okay? We use the term impermeable, okay, if this structure does not allow substances to pass through. The plasma membrane is not permeable or impermeable. It's not completely permeable. It's not completely impermeable. It is semi-permeable. Your book probably uses the term semi-permeable or selectively permeable. It means that not all things are going to be allowed in or out, but some things will. Okay, so the plasma membrane has a property or a characteristic of being selectively permeable. It's going to allow for some things to pass, easily through the membrane, but other substances won't be able to pass so easily, and it's going to require some facilitation, okay, like those transporter proteins that we talked about. But things that can permeate the cell rather easily are going to be like gases, okay, or water can permeate the cell pretty easily. But other things, larger molecules, are going to require some assistance. So let's take a look at some of the processes that allows for things to actually permeate the cell. So the types of molecules that are going to be permeable, readily permeable, that can move easily, are going to be those small hydrophobic molecules, such as gases, oxygen, carbon dioxide. Okay, they can pass across that membrane pretty easily without much assistance. Water, although it's polar, can also pass through that fluid dynamic structure. Things that are going to be relatively impermeable mean that it cannot, permeate that membrane without some assistance. It's going to be larger charged ions, large polar molecules. Okay, so things like the glucose that the cell needs, amino acids, and so forth. Those are going to require some assistance in order to get inside of the cell. So what questions do we have about this concept of cell membrane permeability? Cell membrane permeability. Okay, so let's look at two mechanisms by which things can get into the cell. So diffusion is one way. Okay, diffusion is a process in which substances pass into or out of the cell. Okay, diffusion is unique in that it's based on random motion. Okay, it does not require energy. Make sure you write that down. Okay, because we're going to contrast that with some other processes in a second, some active transport mechanisms that does require energy. So diffusion is a form of passive transport because it does not require energy. So many of the ions and other small molecules that need to get inside the cell, they do so by way of diffusion. Diffusion, by definition, is the movement of molecules across membranes from an area of high concentration to lower concentration. Okay, so the goal here is to try to reach some kind of equilibrium. Okay, so those substances will continue to move from an area of high concentration to a lower concentration. You need to know that definition of diffusion. Okay, diffusion. It's a process in which substances are moving into and out of the cell. It's a form of passive transport in that it does not require energy. Okay, we'll define it as the movement of molecules from an area of high concentration to lower concentration. Okay, so there's two types of diffusion. There's simple diffusion and then there's facilitated diffusion. Okay, simple diffusion where small uncharged or nonpolar molecules move directly through the membrane without any assistance. Okay, some examples are going to be those gases that we mentioned earlier. Oxygen and the carbon dioxide can readily permeate the cell. That's an example of molecules that can move through simple diffusion. Facilitated diffusion is, again, a form of diffusion, so there's no energy required to get these substances across, but it is going to involve these transport proteins to help get these substances across, these larger, more complex molecules. Okay, so facilitated diffusion, again, if you just look at that word facilitated, it's going to give you a hint that there's going to be some kind of carrier mediated process to transport substances into the cell. And that's where those transport proteins come in that we just talked about.
I don't know if it's just my computer, but I can only hear like every other word.
Oh no. Is everyone else hearing me okay? Is my signal bad today? Because I'm not hearing you guys either if you're chiming in. I'm wondering if I have a bad connection today. Okay.
Yeah, I can't hear you. I don't know if everybody else is having that same issue or not.
No one else is responding, but Nicole, the lecture is being recorded, so I will post it if you can go back and just kind of listen to it. Okay, I lost you guys. Are you there? Hello?
Yes, But yeah, I can hear you. It sounds like that I don't know, it just sounds really weird, and we can only hear like every other word that you're saying or every few words, and everybody else said that they were having the same issue, that it wasn't just me.
Oh no. Okay. So here's what I can do, guys. I didn't know that. No, you guys should have said something earlier. Um, I'm gonna record the lecture now. I'll sit here and record it. It's recording. It had been recording the whole time. So I'll upload that. But I think I'll go back and just record the entire lecture and I post it into Canvas. I don't know what's
Yeah,
happening.
I can't even understand what you're saying. It sounds like a robot or something. It sounds really weird. Like I can hear you talking, but I can't understand it.
Okay.
It's like a really poor connection, I think. Okay, okay, good. Okay.
If you can hear me, I'm going to record the lecture and post it into Canvas. Okay, if you can hear me, I'm gonna leave the session now and I will record this tonight, Nicole. Can you hear me at all?
Yes, ma'am, I can hear you now.
Okay. I'll sit here and re-record the whole thing this evening and I'll post it to Canvas.
Okay, so look for it on Canvas tonight.
Hmm. Okay. Yes. And I'll also post the study guides that I mentioned. Can you hear me? Okay.